Thank you. Thank you. So, yeah, I'm a managing partner at Conversion Sciences. We are a turnkey optimization and testing company, actually based in the conversion capital of the world, Austin, Texas. So today we're not going to be talking about mobile optimization best practices because they don't actually exist. Like most other venues in optimization, best practices are a slippery slope. And this is the best practical ops, which my business partner Brian Massey developed for us to remind us of how dangerous best practices can be. What we are going to talk about is what we've learned from hundreds, maybe thousands of mobile tests over the last several years across dozens of sites spanning multiple industries. And so we're going to focus on a few things. One, how do you make sure that you're seeing your mobile experiences the way your visitors do? And then some of the key things you need to take away in terms of optimizing your mobile websites. So before we do, you might have noticed that I'm wearing a lab coat. I saw some of you like rubbing your eyes to make sure you weren't seeing things. It's true, I am. And the only reason I am is because by wearing a lab coat, my ability to focus is going to double, which is important. And I'm going to make half as many cognitive errors. Also important, because I tend to make a lot of them. So every time I make one, you can multiply that by 2, and you'll know how many I avoided making in total. Okay, so quick overview. We've got a lot to cover and not that much time. So we're going to do an overview of the mobile landscape, and then we're going to dismiss it because you guys already know everything that I'm going to say. Then we're going to talk about what you need to do to understand the mobile experiences that you're presenting to your visitors, and then focus on some of the things that you need to test right now if you haven't already started. So mobile marketplace overview. What is the landscape of the mobile marketplace? Big surprise here. Mobile traffic is growing. So this is a graph that shows the aggregate data of all of our e-commerce clients starting in January 2014. And you can see that in the 14 months from that, the percentage of mobile traffic, the share of mobile visitors, almost doubled. And this doesn't mean that the population of the United States doubled and all of a sudden there were twice as many people searching. What this means is that we've seen an explosion of page views, an increase in page views, and most of these mobile page views are kind of additive. So in other words, people are generating more page views than they did before. And so we want to juxtapose this against this. This is a graph from Monotate. And so the dark green is add to cart, and the light green is sales conversions. So I'll draw your attention to these three things. So iPhone, Android phone, and Windows phone. And you can see that the add to cart rate is more or less half of what it is on desktop for these mobile phones. But then the conversion rate is a fraction. Less than 25%. And this isn't anything that we don't already know, that we haven't talked about. The conversion rate is lower on the mobile devices. And there's really two schools of thought here. One school of thought is that, you know what, it's only because we haven't optimized our mobile devices. We haven't cracked the code in our mobile experiences. And once we do that, these conversion rates will shoot up and they'll equal desktop. The other school of thought is, no, that's never going to happen. Mobile will always convert at a lower percentage than desktop. We take a different view. Our view is that mobile visitors are usually going to convert differently than desktop visitors. That's because they're in a different place in the decision-making funnel, the decision-making process. And it's unreasonable to expect them to ever behave, at least in the next 2 to 3 years, maybe 5, the same way we see desktop visitors behaving. So we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But I want to talk about what you need to do to understand your mobile websites. And that's not a typo. I mean, on one domain, you have multiple mobile websites. So really think of them as experiences, right? So we have a multitude of combinations of devices, operating systems, browsers, and screen resolutions. In addition, we have different network speeds and connections. Every one of those meaningful combinations is a slightly different experience. And it's your job to actually, this is easy information to get in analytics, it's your job as somebody who's in charge of optimizing the mobile experience to understand what your top 10 most important combinations are and go through your site looking at those combinations. Either get your hand on the physical devices or use some of the emulators that are available. I mean, this just illustrates up through iPhone 6 Plus how many different screen resolutions, taking out of account the different operating system variants and browser variants that you are responsible for creating a solid experience on. So that's job number one. Understand what type of mobile experience you're giving your visitors. See it the same way. And there are just little simple things that you have to take into consideration. How many of you know the percentage of your visitors that go from horizontal to landscape sometime during the session? I see 1, 2 people. Let's give those guys a round of applause because clearly they're doing something in their analytics that the rest of us aren't doing. This is important. So even when we run tests on mobile, we have a little JavaScript snippet that we've written to fire a custom conversion because we want to know if we're impacting this. And in fact, it's kind of fascinating. We see almost on average across our portfolio of clients, roughly 10% of the visitors switch from horizontal to landscape at some point in time during their session. And we don't necessarily know what it means, right? Some people just do it because it's easier for them to read. It creates longer lines of text. The text is a little bit bigger. But it does have implications, and you need to understand when it's happening and where it's happening. Because when you think about responsive, landscape changes the responsive layout. We see a lot of horizontal responsive experiences totally break in landscape. So it's something that's important to know. Here's another really simple concept, but I see people make this mistake all the time. We used to make this mistake years ago. We'd be evaluating client websites, and we'd be in our super fast Wi-Fi connection, and we've got a huge usability lab. We've got all sorts of mobile devices, and we go through the site, and it's like, this is great. Everything loads smoothly, but they're called mobile devices because people are mobile when they're using them, and they're not always connected to Wi-Fi. So it's important, if you want to see your site through your visitor's eyes, that you actually get off the Wi-Fi and use slower connections. Same thing whenever you're QAing test variations before you launch a test. There are some things that will break on slower connections that you're not going to see if you're on fast Wi-Fi. Simple principles, but I see people make these mistakes all the time. Like I said, we used to as well. So optimizing your mobile websites. What are some of the key things you can do? This is a much longer conversation than 30 minutes, but we'll do the best we can. First of all, at least in terms of new customer acquisition, you have to understand that mobile is screen one. Second of all, you're going to have to learn how to arse. It's not a new dance. It's something that I'll explain in a moment. And then a lot of what we do in terms of generating hypotheses, especially on mobile, it's fairly easy, right? We can just emulate what our visitors already know instead of trying to teach them a different way to use our sites. We're going to talk a little bit about responsive. Should you have a dedicated mobile site? Should you have a responsive site? If you do go responsive, should you do it responsively? Yes, you should. Different experiences for iOS versus Android. Vastly different audiences, and we'll touch on that. And then we've got a handful of things that if you haven't already tested or you're just starting your mobile optimization program, a handful of things that you should definitely test and start with that have consistently yielded results. So mobile is the first impression. So we know from research that Google has shared that the majority of mobile search terms compared to desktop search terms are shorter. They're more top of the funnel. So if you kind of want to create a mental model for yourself, let's say you're buying a flat screen TV, you're starting to shop for a car or whatever. The way a lot of consumers today do that is when they're stopped at a traffic light or they're waiting at a restaurant for their friend to meet them for lunch, or let's face it, they're sitting on the toilet. They're going to start searching for things like best LCD TV, LCD first cognitive error, televisions 2016. And over time, so what they're doing is they're building a consideration set of what television they might want to buy and who they might want to buy it for. And it's very top of the funnel, and a lot of this happens on mobile. And over time, they're going to start to switch to desktop. So here's some interesting numbers to look at. So for mobile research, almost 50% of mobile researchers start on search engines. And you can see the rest are starting on branded sites and branded apps. So I would assume that a lot of these are brands that they already have an affinity for, and I would also assume a heavy chunk is Amazon. So for new customer acquisition, let's focus on the search engines. So as these people are searching, they're deciding what they want. They're refining their consideration set. What happens whenever they convert? So interestingly, the vast majority convert in store, and this shouldn't be surprising. But let's ignore that. Let's just focus on the digital conversion paths. For those that convert digitally, more than double have flipped over to the desktop and tablet, 45% compared to 17%. So they do the research on mobile, and they move to desktop in order to complete the purchase. And it's happening on your sites too. So one of the things before we move forward, one of the things that you have to do is you have to make sure that whenever they're ready to make that switch, that you are in front of them. One of the easiest ways to do that is capture their email address. The email address on mobile should be goal number one for most of us in this room, so that we can stay in front of the visitor and maintain our position as part of their consideration set. So ARS, what does ARS mean? It means avoid really stupid shit, because we see a lot of stupid shit on mobile all the time. And I've broken it down into three main categories. The first one are click jails. So a click jail is somewhere where you literally cannot get out of the experience. So this is from, I clicked through on a link, I wanted to read something about the MBA, and I got this interstitial, which is really poorly designed. You should never have an interstitial or a modal that doesn't have an X on it and that covers the entire page. So what they want me to do, instead of reading the article that I wanted to read while I was probably stopped at a traffic light or something, is download their app. But I don't want to download the app. I'm not interested at all. I want to continue on to read the article. So they've already created some friction. But I have to click this link. This is the only way I can move forward. But the problem is when I go to hover over that link, it fires the browser controls. And therefore, I only have two options. Well, I guess I have three. But the two reasonable options are I can download the app, or I can just go back and say, forget this. The third option isn't really relevant. Scroll maps, or scroll jails rather. So we see this a lot, almost exclusively with maps. How many people have maps embedded on their pages? Any local businesses with maps embedded? Not a lot. So typically these are embedded in an iframe, and there's a setting that you can choose to make them static. Most people don't do that. So this is this is a screenshot from an iPhone 6, and you can see that the map takes quite a bit of space. Unlike an iPhone 4 or the new iPhone 7, that map's going to take up pretty much all of the space. And if the map is not locked, what happens? You're scrolling along, consuming the content, and then you hit the map. And all of a sudden, the map is scrolling within the iframe. So not only have you taken the pin where the address is, and they're never going to find it again, they're stuck. This experience on an iPhone 4 and an iPhone 5 was almost impossible to get out of. And the last is really common sense, so asking for too much information. We can actually debate whether or not fewer fields are better on desktop. We've seen examples where actually adding more fields creates a psychological advantage for us. But on mobile, there really isn't a debate. Almost every test we've ever run where we're reducing form fields on mobile, it wins. And ironically, this is a form field from Adobe to download a white paper on mobile optimization. I didn't complete it. So don't get greedy. I know we want to be greedy as marketers and we think we need more information, but identify the smallest amount of information possible that you can ask for and move forward. And for e-commerce, we've started testing like auto address complete and things like that to make it much easier. It's just a pain in the ass to fill these things out on a mobile device. Emulate what they already know. So your visitors are spending a vast amount of time on their mobile devices. And only a fraction of it is actually surfing the web. Most of it is on Facebook, playing games, looking for love, checking on sports scores, the news, whatever. So whenever they're doing that, they're being trained how to use their mobile devices. That's creating the UI, UX expectation for the mobile experience. This graph, when I first saw it, blew me away. This is how much time people spend on mobile devices. 80% of it is on apps. 80% of it is on apps. And you can see games, Facebook, and then there's a selection of other things. Only 20% on the browser. And the browser, that's where we're trying to convert these new customers, right? So all the training that they're getting in terms of how things should work, it's happening on the app side. So it's not difficult at all to find out where your customers are doing whenever they're in that 80% of the apps. So that's a great resource for hypotheses. A great way to identify things that they already expect and to give it to them to reduce friction. So here's an example. We've seen this coming over the last few years. I jokingly call it the Tinder effect. So like where you're showing content sliding left to right, right? We're seeing this everywhere, news, media, starting to see it in e-commerce. You can churn through a lot of rich content and information just by swiping left and right. And it's not because of like the rise in apps, I say it joking, like Tinder or whatever, where people are swiping left and right. They didn't invent that. It's just simple physiology. It's one of the easiest things to do when you're holding a phone, is just move left to right. And so you can see the example like from Orvis here, where they're showing different category information on a category page, and it engages people. Responsive. So we've got to talk about responsive. We've got to talk about how you make a mobile experience for your visitors that is designed to get them to convert. So what is responsive? I think most of us probably know, but essentially responsive is a simple piece of software, a simple template that evaluates a visitor as they come to your site, and it says, okay, they're at this screen resolution, I should show them this content, right? So it's making decisions about what order things should be in, and in some cases, whether something should even exist or not. So a non-intelligent piece of software making critical decisions about what content to show your visitors. That sounds great. I don't know why we don't do that for all of our websites. Here's an example. So this is a site we worked on for several years. This is the desktop version. And when we first started working on this site wants people to call, by the way. Phone calls are pretty much the only goal they care about. When we first started working on this site, we tested several different iterations of language and placement of that language, call to action language centered around getting people to call. This was the winner, and it was a massive winner, 57% increase in phone calls, huge. So for SEO purposes, we actually, instead of using this as text, we use it as an image. These guys were early adopters to responsive. This was their responsive site, even after we rolled that image to control. The responsive design made a decision to remove the image. So that was stupid. And we said, let's put this back. So we just made a tweak to the logic, and we got a 26% increase. It's not really a 26% increase. It's actually getting back the 26% we were losing because we were doing something stupid. We see this a lot. Here's another example. This is a site in the same industry, obviously a different site, kind of a directory, and the whole purpose of this is you're on a state page and you want to drill down to a city, and so you can find a provider within the city. You guys in the front, can you read the city names here pretty reasonably? I'm just going to pretend everybody said yes. They all shook their heads no, though. On a desktop, you could. So this was the equivalent of the mobile experience. Can you see that now? No. So you literally, to read a city name, you had to pinch and zoom, and the customer said, this can't be good. We want to go responsive so that we can give a better experience to our mobile visitors. And we said, you know what, why don't you let us test that before you actually do it? We can emulate the responsive design. The JavaScript to do that is very cheap compared to actually rolling it out to code. Let's see what happens. So we took this and essentially turned it into this for the mobile visitors. Fairly easy to read. You can read the cities. So how many people think this was better? Everybody who raised their hand hates money. You all hate money because it resulted in a 19% drop in conversion. There's some interesting psychology behind why. I don't have time to get into it, but a better experience isn't always a better experience. We don't know what a better experience is. Here's a fun example. So this is a pet hospital, veterinarians. They have a national footprint, several thousand locations. This is their pay-per-click landing page. This is their responsive mobile version of that. And it just decided that it didn't need a logo, right? Who needs branding? Who needs trust? Who needs credibility that comes from being in decades of business? They don't. They don't really need it. On top of that, responsive designs, because they're having to go through all these decisions, and things are getting better. But 2 years ago, Internet Retailer found that for large e-commerce companies with responsive design, it took 18.24 seconds on average for their home pages to load. That's more than a little too long. And here's the biggest problem. Responsive design also requires a redesign of your desktop. Go back to that graph we looked at. What's the bread and butter? It's desktop traffic. And it doesn't have to be this way, but most people redesign incorrectly. There's 4 or 5 people in a room that make stupid decisions in a vacuum, and they launch a site, and the conversion rate tanks. So we want to make the experience better for our mobile visitors. We're going to use responsive, but it's going to make stupid decisions. And oh, by the way, in order to do that, we're going to put our desktop conversion rate at risk. It doesn't mean that responsive is not a direction to go in. It just means you have to do it responsively. You make the decisions and test every single thing. So just a true story, a little aside, an anecdote. Before that experience that I showed you guys where the huge winner was removed, this is actually what my hair looked like. True story. And then that happened, and it really freaked me out. I couldn't sleep that night. I was fretting. I woke up the next morning, and this is what it looked like. I thought maybe at first I'd eaten too many beets or something, but it just turns out I take this stuff really seriously. So we're still seeing this nonsense, and I've run some extrapolations, and unfortunately for me, this is like one more year. 1 more year, 2 years, it's this. So I need everybody in this room collectively to let's get on board with doing responsive responsibly instead of the stuff that we've seen. Okay, not really a true story, obviously. So if you don't remember anything else from this, remember what I'm about to talk about, iOS versus Android, and the picture of me as an 85-year-old man, because that's kind of hilarious. So these are two vastly different audiences. Are they both mobile? Yes. But they behave completely differently. So here's an example of a header redesign we did for a client. This is literally the only example in years of testing and segmenting the tests between Android and iOS that we had a positive result for both. Only one. Usually it's something more like this, a large to moderate increase for one and very negative for the other. So if you're not segmenting your mobile tests by iOS and Android, you're going to create garbage data because more often than not they end up canceling each other out. Just tons of examples. Here's a menu on an e-commerce jewelry shop. Totally different preference. I could do a whole presentation on this. So here's an example of a different header redesign. Here's an example of a cart redesign. iOS positive, Android negative. Here's an example of an e-commerce category page. The same thing. So A, you have to segment your test by iOS and Android. If you get lucky, you're going to find examples or variations that are positive for both. But if not, that's when the power of personalization and using your testing tools to show one to one group and another to the other comes into play. Okay, so what to test first? We're going to start with headlines and calls to action. Frankly, this is one of the things we test early on, regardless of mobile or desktop, because the language you use to ask people to take action is incredibly critical. So this is an example. I can't tell you the name of the company. I can't show you the creative. I can't even tell you what industry they're in. But the results of this were so fascinating to me that I at least wanted to share the language just to illustrate the difference between mobile and desktop visitors. So the control, customize your search. Then we had two variations, get a quote and find your nearest location. Look at the results. So this is basically a service where we're looking to add a modification to your vehicle. So desktop visitors were fine. Customize your search, that sounds all right. I'm on this laptop, I've got all this screen real estate, it's easy to use, that sounds great. Didn't sound good at all to mobile visitors. Get a quote or find your nearest location, with obviously get a quote being the biggest winner. Path of least resistance. This is what appealed to mobile visitors. So this even suggests that your core call to action headline language has to be different between mobile and desktop because they're in completely different places. Sticky calls to action. So just so we're all on the same page, something sticky is something that stays in the same position as people scroll. You guys probably all know that, but I just wanted to illustrate it, just in case. So let's go back to this example. I promise this isn't the only site we work on, but it lends itself well to examples because we've been working on it for a long time. So this was the existing control header. And we made it sticky. We saw a 9% increase. All it was is a logo, phone number, and actually the domain name. So then we started to do more useful things like add calls to action. And we saw additional larger increases. So over time, this header has evolved. We redesigned it, put the logo and the hamburger menu together, added a search icon, added a phone icon. We've recently actually started exploring, is it better on the bottom or the top? And in this case, on the bottom is better. Now here's what's interesting. I think consumers are actually going to get fatigued with this. So we first started seeing this a few years ago on basically media sites. It's a way that they deliver ads. And whenever it was relatively new and we started testing it, we saw bigger gains than we're seeing now. And in fact, this morning I was looking at data for a test we just launched 5 days ago for a client that actually had an example like this, like the bottom sticky. And one of our variations was, let's remove it. And that variation is killing it, like triple digit killing it. So again, this isn't something that you should just go and put on your site if you don't have it, but it's a highly leverageable thing that you can do that you should at least test. Using the footer. So typically we see that mobile visitors are far more willing to scroll all the way down a page. And like in this case, the scroll maps indicated that our mobile visitors, 50% of them were reaching the bottom of the page. And we were providing nothing of value for these people. They get to the bottom and they're parked there. So we devised a couple of simple experiments, simple variations, to reiterate the value proposition and to try to compel them to pick up the phone and call. This was the winner. So a moderate increase, 8% increase in conversion rate. What was really interesting about this, though, is that this variation actually had over 20% increase in average call time. So we only got an 8% lift in calls, but this content right here, in combination with the fact that it was at the bottom of the page, led to a higher quality caller. Welcome mats. So we see these in all sorts of flavors. Download the app, open in the app, register, sign up for our newsletter. In e-commerce, the most common is give us your email address and we'll give you 10% off. There's some pretty common design principles that you need to bear in mind when you're rolling these out. The Etsy example is terrible. They can probably get away with it because these might be existing customers that already have the app. Never cover the whole screen and make sure that they can click anywhere out of the welcome mat to close it. Like I said, the offer in e-commerce is pretty standard. I like to play with 5%, 10%, 15% off, play with the design. But it's a little bit less clear in a lead generation environment. And I've seen a lot of people shy away from this whenever you're just trying to say generate phone calls or generate leads because you're saying, it's too soon. But what we've found is if you can actually crystallize your value proposition in customer-centric or visitor-centric language, even in these lead generation environments, it works really well. So here are a couple of examples, a couple iterations that we actually tested in the last 6 months. And you can see that the one with the person outperformed this one. This wasn't the first time we tested. These are probably the third or fourth generation iterations. A couple of interesting things. So you can see that this header is pink. We also tested this on desktop. So we tested this with a pink and a blue. On desktop, pink tanked, blue was awesome. And on mobile, pink was awesome and blue tanked. I have no idea why. I don't. A couple other things. So this is an example of business porn, which we're typically totally against. So stock imagery is generally an attractive, racially ambiguous woman who's smiling on a headset. And it never works, except for whenever it does. And in this case, it did. And we've also been experimenting with this. Instead of phone numbers, if you want people to call, buttons, click to call. They actually draw more attention than phone numbers, and it's training people or letting people do what they've already been trained to do. So alternative mobile goals. This is the last thing we're going to cover here. So remember, your mobile visitors, at least in terms of new customer acquisition, vastly different from your desktop visitors. Our belief is that most of the time they're going to convert differently. So, we've all seen these studies about the desire lines, right? There is what you think your mobile customers want, and there's what they're actually going to do. So you have to dig into your data to find these desire lines, the paths that they've created, despite what your civil engineers or people that you thought they wanted to do. So remember I said email, getting somebody's email address on mobile should be your top priority. Here's an example. Just whenever we get people into the cart with this particular customer, if they're leaving or hitting the back button, we fire this. Let us email you a link to the cart. It's obvious you don't want to complete the purchase right now. That's cool. Let us just email you a link. That way we can email them the link and then stay in front of them. And we saw a huge increase in conversion rates on direct visitors from desktop when we did this. Here's a really extreme example. This is what I'll end with. So this is from a customer that does online sign design. So you can design banners and signs and things of that nature. This is their desktop tool. So you can go in and design a sign. This is their mobile tool. It's a flash-based tool, didn't work. And this is reflected in the conversion rates for desktop versus mobile. So we said, look, we're playing with house money here. Let us try something a little bit different. So instead of redesigning your tool, nobody is ever going to design these banners and signs on a mobile device. So let's just get their email address. So basically you say, look, it's not a good idea to design a sign on a mobile device. Give us your name and email, and we'll send you a link back to this page whenever you're on the proper device. We've had a moderate 5.3% take on the offer. But at their numbers, that's 16,000 new email addresses per year. And this is a company that really, their bread and butter is email marketing. So this resulted in something meaningful. Alternative mobile goals. So that's it. Thank you.